At 6 minutes past 7 on the evening of the 21st of October, 1978, a 20-year-old pilot named Frederick Valentich keyed his radio, somewhere over the dark water of Bass Strait, and asked Melbourne Air Traffic Control a strange question. Was there any known traffic below 5,000 feet in his area? There was not, they told him. And Valentich said that a large aircraft had just passed over him, that it had 4 bright lights, that it seemed to be an aircraft, but he couldn't be sure. Over the next 6 minutes, calm and controlled at first, and then increasingly not, he described a shining metal object with a green light orbiting above his small Cessna, pacing him, playing some kind of game with him. His engine began to cough and run rough, and then he said the sentence that has kept this case alive for nearly 50 years. It's not an aircraft. 17 seconds of strange, metallic, scraping sound followed. Then silence. Frederick Valentich, his Cessna, and every trace of both of them were never seen again. Not a body, not a seat cushion, not a confirmed piece of wreckage. Nothing at all, in a search that covered thousands of square kilometres. This is Ancient Aussie History, where we go looking for the parts of this country most people never find, and the ancient story most of us were never taught in school. Subscribe now, and if you'd rather listen, every episode is also a podcast on Spotify, link below. And leave a comment telling me, before we get into it, which way you lean. Something ordinary and tragic, or something no one has ever managed to explain? Because by the end, I'm not sure the honest answer is either. An ordinary flight. Start with how utterly routine this was supposed to be. Frederick Valentich was a young man who wanted, more than almost anything, to fly for a living. He had a Class 4 instrument rating, around 150 hours in his logbook, and a habit, noted by those who knew him, of taking flying very seriously. He was also, by several accounts, genuinely interested in the subject of UFOs, a detail that would later be used against his story and, by others, in favour of it. On that Saturday evening, he took off from Moorabbin Airport on the southeastern edge of Melbourne at around 6:19 in a rented Cessna 182, registration Victor Hotel Delta Sierra Juliet. His plan was a night flight down the Victorian coast, over the Cape Otway lighthouse, and then south across Bass Strait to King Island, a run of roughly 125 nautical miles. He had told people he was going to pick up some crayfish. Whether that was the real reason, or a reason at all, is one of the many small threads in this case that never quite tie off. What is certain is that the weather was clear, the flight was straightforward, and there was no reason on earth to expect that a 20-year-old on a milk run to King Island would become the centre of one of the most famous aviation mysteries in the world. The transmission. At 6 minutes past 7, cruising in the dark somewhere near Cape Otway, Valentich made his first call. He asked Melbourne whether there was any traffic below him. Told there was none, he reported that a large aircraft had just passed about 1,000 feet overhead. Melbourne asked him to confirm the aircraft type. He couldn't. It had, he said, 4 bright landing lights, and it had gone past at high speed. Over the next few minutes, his reports grew stranger, and his voice grew tenser. The aircraft, if that's what it was now orbiting above him. It was approaching from the east. It seemed to be playing some sort of game, he said, flying over him at speeds he couldn't estimate. Then came the details that lifted this out of the ordinary altogether. The object, he told Melbourne, was not an aircraft. It had a long shape. It was shining, all shiny on the outside, like polished metal, and it had a green light on it. And, most unsettling of all, his own engine had begun to cough and run roughly, and he was having trouble keeping the Cessna running. His last full transmission is worth quoting as closely as the official record allows. He reported that he was orbiting, and that the thing was orbiting on top of him. He said, again, that it was not an aircraft. And then his voice was cut off. Replaced, on the recording, by 17 seconds of an odd, metallic, scraping noise, like something rhythmic and mechanical, before the channel went completely dead. The time was around 12 minutes past 7. From the first call to the final silence, the whole encounter had lasted about 6 minutes. The search that found nothing. If you've made it this far, here's the part that makes this case genuinely hard to close, in either direction. Subscribe now if you want more of this series, because what happened next is a wall that every theory eventually runs into. Melbourne launched a response almost immediately. An air and sea search began that night and ran for days. Aircraft, ships, and a Royal Australian Air Force P-3 Orion combing the waters of Bass Strait and the coastline around Cape Otway and King Island. Bass Strait is not a forgiving place. It is a notorious stretch of water, cold and rough and deep. But it had been searched exhaustively for lost aircraft before, and it usually gives something back. An oil slick, floating debris, a fuel sheen, a piece of a wing. This time, it gave back nothing at all. No wreckage, no body, no sign that a Cessna had ever come down there. A young man and a 1,500-pound aircraft had, to all appearances, simply ceased to exist. That total absence is the hinge of the whole mystery, because a plane that crashes leaves a mess, and this one left a silence. And silence is exactly the thing that both the believers and the skeptics have spent decades trying to fill. And it is worth understanding the place itself, because Bass Strait has a reputation, and it did not earn it lightly. The strait is the stretch of water separating mainland Australia from Tasmania. Shallow, storm-swept, and treacherous, with fierce currents where the Southern Ocean and the Tasman Sea meet. It has swallowed ships since the earliest days of colonial navigation, and it has swallowed aircraft too. In the years before and after Valentich, the strait was the scene of other unexplained aviation losses. Planes that flew out over that water and were simply never accounted for. To some, that pattern is proof only of how dangerous the crossing is, how easily the strait erases what falls into it. To others, it has given Bass Strait a darker nickname and a folklore all its own, an Australian answer to the Bermuda Triangle. Either way, it means Valentich vanished into one of the few places in the country genuinely capable of taking a whole aircraft and giving nothing back. Which cuts both ways, because it makes both the ordinary explanation and the strange one harder to rule out. The grounded explanation. So let's be fair and start with the mundane, because there is a genuinely serious case for it, and it deserves to be heard properly rather than waved away. The leading conventional explanation is spatial disorientation, and specifically that Valentich, a relatively inexperienced pilot flying at night over black, featureless water with no visible horizon, became disoriented, lost track of which way was up, and ended up flying inverted without realizing it. Here is why that theory is not as crazy as it sounds, and how it accounts for the very details that seem most alien. Flying upside down over still, dark water, a pilot's own navigation and landing lights can reflect off the surface below, which, when you're inverted, appears above you. 4 bright lights. A shiny, metallic-looking object. A green light, the standard color of a starboard navigation light. An aircraft that paces you perfectly, mirrors your every move, and orbits when you orbit, because it is you, reflected. And an engine that begins to cough and run rough because, in a prolonged, inverted or steeply banked attitude, a Cessna's fuel system starves and the engine falters, exactly as Valentich described. On this reading, the 17 seconds of metallic scraping is the sound of the aircraft breaking up, or the microphone keyed as it hit the water in what pilots grimly call a graveyard spiral. It is a tidy, physically coherent, and deeply tragic explanation, and a lot of serious aviation people believe some version of it. There are other grounded theories too, and it would be dishonest not to mention them. Some have suggested Valentich staged his own disappearance, or took his own life, pointing to reported difficulties in his life and career, and to the fact that no one could ever fully confirm why he was really making that flight. Others have proposed simple fuel exhaustion or mechanical failure. Each of these turns the case from a mystery into a tragedy, and each is entirely possible. The parts that don't sit still. And yet, if the inverted flight explanation were airtight, This would be a footnote, not a legend. And it isn't airtight. There are details that the tidy version has to strain to hold. For one, Valentich was talking to Melbourne the entire time, describing what he saw in real time, and at no point did he sound like a man who thought he was in trouble with his own aircraft. He sounded like a man watching something outside his window. He had time to describe shape, colour, movement, behaviour. Disorientation severe enough to fly you inverted into the sea usually does not come with 6 minutes of calm, articulate commentary. For another, there is the matter of corroboration. On that same evening, along that same coast, a number of people on the ground reported seeing an unusual green light in the sky over the water. Independent of Valentich, before they could have known anything about his radio calls. That does not prove anything landed or hovered. But it is not nothing either. And then there is the physical footnote that refuses to resolve. In 1983, 5 years later, an engine cowl flap from a Cessna 182 washed ashore on Flinders Island, in the general area, within the range of serial numbers that included Valentich's aircraft. It sounds like closure. Until you learn that the partial serial number did not conclusively match his plane, and that other 182s had shed the same part in the same waters around the same time. So even the one piece of possible wreckage is itself unresolved, a maybe that has stayed a maybe for over 40 years. Even the 17 seconds of sound resist a clean answer. When a NASA-affiliated researcher, Dr. Richard Haines, analysed the recording, he found the noise was made up of dozens of separate metallic bursts with sharp, consistent starts and stops, 36 of them, with no discernible pattern in time or frequency. Consistent with an aircraft breaking apart? Perhaps. Consistent with something else? He couldn't say. Which is, in a way, the whole case in miniature. Everything about it is consistent with an ordinary tragedy, and none of it is quite enough to prove one. There is also the human shape of it, which is part of why the story never faded. Valentich's father, Guido, spent the rest of his life believing his son had been taken by a UFO rather than killed by a mistake at the controls. And whatever the truth, you can understand why a grieving parent would hold on to the version in which his boy did nothing wrong. In the decades since, the case has been picked over in books, documentaries, and endless late-night arguments, precisely because it sits in the one place that is hardest for people to tolerate: genuine uncertainty. We want the flying saucer ending or the tidy crash report. What we actually have is a young man's voice, calm and then frightened, describing something over a live radio link, and then a silence that has never once been filled with a fact solid enough to end the argument. What actually remains? None of this needs aliens to be a genuine mystery, and it's worth being honest and grounded about that, the way we always try to be here. The evidence does not force us to conclude that Frederick Valentich was taken by a spacecraft, and the most probable single explanation: a young pilot, disoriented over dark water at night, describing his own reflection in the seconds before a fatal spiral, is mundane, coherent, and almost unbearably sad. It is very likely what happened. Anyone who tells you the case is definitely extraterrestrial is claiming more than the evidence allows. But anyone who tells you the case is definitely closed is doing the same thing. Because the honest position, nearly 50 years on, is that the Department of Transport investigated it thoroughly and could not determine a cause. Presumed fatal, cause unknown. A 20-year-old flew into a clear evening sky over Bass Strait, calmly described something orbiting his aircraft that he insisted was not an aircraft, was cut off by 17 seconds of metallic noise, and vanished so completely that the sea gave back not one certain fragment of him. Whatever really happened up there, a reflection, misread in a moment of terror, or something none of us has a name for, it happened in the space of 6 minutes, on an open radio channel, narrated by the one person who saw it. And then it was gone.